Hi. Right, this is a little story I wrote uh, 11 years ago called Meet the Moggles. A short story, Chapter 1. Somewhere in the darkest woods where nobody ever goes, there is a special place where fantasy and magic lives forever. A place where flowers never die and happiness is in the air they breathe. This is where Bubble Maze Hill rests. It's a magical home of the Moggles, who are strange little creatures who like nothing more than eating mushroom soup and doing magic. One day, Hobart, who was a Moglet, which is a young Moggle, was down by the stream with his brother Kozo, picking mushrooms for some fresh hot soup, when all of a sudden they both felt the earth shake. In fact, it was so strong that it knocked poor Hobart off his feet. "Wow, what was that?" said Hobart. "It felt like the ground was sneezing," was Kozo's reply. All of a sudden, a large ogre came jumping and leaping over the hill, and he was heading straight for the Moglets. "Holy gazooks!" shouted Hobart. "There's a giant coming straight towards us." Both Kozo and Hobart picked up their bag of mushrooms and decided to run as fast as they could. "Wait!" shouted the ogre. "I mean you no harm. I need your help." Hobart stopped running and called to Kozo to do the same. They both turned and looked at the ogre. They were both quite scared but didn't want to show it. "Please," said the ogre, "don't be frightened." "What's wrong?" asked Kozo. "You look rather sad." "I am," said the ogre. "I have had my home taken away from me by some horrible creatures." "What creatures?" asked Albert. "The Elwins," was the ogre's reply. Both Hobart and Kozo looked at each other in puzzlement. They had never heard of the Elwins. Now the Elwins were the total opposite of the Moggles. They were rather horrid little creatures who lived in a place called the Dark Wood. They took things that didn't belong to them, but no one never really did anything about it because everyone was always too scared of the Elwins. The ogre told the Moglets all about the Elwins. Both Hobart and Kozo were not only scared of the story that they heard, but was also feeling very sorry for the poor ogre. So they decided to take him back to their little home in the woods. Hobart and Kozo's parents gave the ogre some hot mushroom soup and asked his name. "Wendell," was his reply. "Very nice to meet you, Wendell," said the Moglet's mother as she sat with father. It was a very tight squeeze for Wendell. The Moggle's home was not exactly a very big place, but it was comfortable all the same. The Moggles offered Wendell a bed for the night, and he gladly accepted. Come morning, there was really nothing mother and father could do for Wendell. After all, the Elwins were very notorious creatures, and no one wanted to cross their path. This upset both Hobart and Kozo, not to mention Wendell. All the Muggles could suggest to Wendell was to either live in Bubble Maze Hill or find a home elsewhere in the woods. This made the ogre very sad indeed, but he decided that he would try and face up to the Elwins himself, even if it meant getting hurt in the process. Now Wendell was not like other ogres. For one, he was not at all scary, and he was as harmless as a butterfly. Anyway, the Moglet's parents wished him good luck and waved him goodbye. Both Hobart and Kozo said that they would walk with Wendell down to the stream for company. While on their little journey, Hobart came up with a very dangerous idea. He suggested that both he and Kozo would go with Wendell and help him get his home back. Kozo disagreed. "What would mother and father say?" said Kozo. "But it's an adventure, Kozo. Mother and father would understand. We can't let poor Wendell fight the Elwins on his own," said Hobart. "Besides, we can do magic. We can use that against them." Kozo was unsure. "But we are only Moglets. We are only starting to learn magic," he said, "and our magic is not very powerful." But Hobart was having none of it. He knew he could help the ogre with or without Kozo. After some dispute, Kozo decided that he would help that ogre and his brother. After all, Hobart was right. It is an adventure, and it gets to prove to themselves as well. Wendell was delighted at the news. Chapter 2. Our three heroes set off into the dark and deep woods to where Wendell's home rests. When they reached their destination, there was a high-pitched chanting and shrieking coming from Ogar's home. "Ouch! My ears hurt," said Kozo. "That's the Elwins," said Wendell. "They are singing." "We are going to have to think of a way on how to get your home back," said Obert. "Let's charge down there and sprinkle some magic dust over them," said Kozo. "I have a bag in my pocket. It may work." "That's a good idea," was Hobart's reply. Kozo thought it was a good idea for him to cause a distraction so Hobart and Wendell could charge the house. Hobart could sprinkle the magic dust while Wendell would try and scare them. Kozo, feeling very brave, sneaked around to the back of the house and on tiptoe. He looked through the window. There, for the first time in his life, he saw the Elwins. He did not think that they looked that scary at all. In fact, Wendell, the ogre, looked more frightening. But what poor Kozo did not hear was two big Elwins standing right behind him, grinning, very evil-like, back down at him. Then, before Kozo could shout out for help, he was grabbed and bundled into a dirty old sack, dropping his bag of magic dust onto the ground. Meanwhile, Hobart and Wendell were just about to charge down the hill to the ogre's house when they heard Kozo shouting for help. It was quite muffled, but it was definitely Kozo. Then they saw not only the two large Elwins, but at least another 12. And they were carrying a sack as they left the house, which was wiggling more erratic than a dancing snake. "Holy diddy-dots," shouted Hobart. "They have Kozo." "What are we going to do?" said Wendell. "There is only one thing we can do," said Hobart. "We are going to have to rescue him." Things were just getting pretty worse for the Moglets. Not only has Kozo been taken by the Elwins, but they have now put themselves in a very dangerous situation. Plus, Hobart would have to explain everything to his parents once he gets Kozo back. Hobart and Wendell sat down and thought very hard of a plan how to get Kozo back. "Wendell, do you know exactly where the Elwins live?" said Hobart. "Yes, but it's so dangerous," was Wendell's reply. "So be it, my friend, but we have to take our chances," said Hobart. Wendell explained to Hobart about the dark wood where the Elwins live. He had never been there himself, but he had heard some scary stories about the place. This frightened Hobart a bit, but he didn't want to show it in front of Wendell. Back at Bubble Maze Hill, word had got around that Hobart and Kozo had not come back from walking Wendell down to the stream. Panic was in the air. Our hero's parents were very worried. Could it have been a trap set by the ogre to have eaten the Moglets? After all, they didn't really know Wendell that well. Now, just on the other side of Bubble Maze Hill lived a small group of creatures called the Lovelets, who were the Moggles' neighbours, but were more braver, and they volunteered to go in search of the Moglets, taking with them their leader, Chubby Pudding, who was neither a Moggle nor a Lovett, but he was the head of the village, where both the Moggles and the Lovelets lived. Now, the Lovelets were taking no chances. Chubby may be very round and very fat, but he was the bravest of them all, and he was in charge. Meanwhile, Hobart and Wendell set off on their quest to the notorious Dark Wood. It took at least an hour to get there, but it seemed like a lifetime to Hobart. He was so worried about his brother that his legs started to wibble and wobble like an underdone pot of jelly. Wendell, being a good friend, picked Hobart up and sat him on his shoulder. Hobart thanked him. As they entered the dark wood, both Hobart and Wendell became very nervous of what lay in store, but both did not want to show it to each other. The dark wood was indeed very dark and eerie, with some high screeching echoing through the tall, thin trees. They were both cautious. Then, past a dense mound of bushes and shrubs, there was a golden glowing light which looked like a fire. "This must be it," said Hobart. That must be the Elwins' home." Chapter 3. Chubby Pudding and the Lovelets were hot on the friends' trail. They had reached Wendell's home, hoping that the Moggles would be there. But how wrong could they be? There was no sign of the Moggles or an ogre. This now became more worrying than they had thought. "There are no Moggles here," said Chubby Pudding in his deep booming voice. But there was a dirty, horrid footprint which was all over the floor. "Oh dear," said Chubby. "This looks like the work of Elwyn's. And this is the case, we could be up against some nasty little characters," he said. But Elwyn's didn't bother Chubby. He wasn't scared of them. He saw one once, and to be honest, Chubby thought he looked like, well, quite pathetic. Back in the dark wood, both Wendell and Hobart were planning their rescue of Kozo. The Elwyns lived in a huge cave which seemed to have only one way in and one way out. This was going to be very tricky. Not only had they not come up with an idea of how to get Kozo, bollocks. This was going to be a very tricky. Not only have to come up with an idea of how to get into the cave, but how they would also have to try and locate poor Kozo if he is still alive. That was something that Hobart did not want to think about. All of a sudden, Hobart came up with a plan. "I have an idea, Wendell," said Hobart. "If I stand outside the cave's entrance and cause a distraction by creating loud bangs and snaps with some magic dust, then hopefully the Elwyns will all come out. Then, as they do, you sneak into the cave and look for Kozo, and then get him back." To be honest, Wendell thought it was a stupid plan, but any plan was better than no plan. Besides, he couldn't even come up with anything himself. "Okay, let's do it," said Wendell's reply after several seconds of thinking. So Wendell went round to the side of the cave and crouched down as low as he could behind a rock. At that point, Hobart gave him the nod, and Wendell gave him the thumbs up. Hobart reached into his bag and his pocket and pulled out a small, tiny little bag of magic dust. There was maybe 2 handfuls, but it was enough for his plan. Hobart stood near the mouth of the cave. Then he threw the magic dust on the ground, saying the magic spell. "Miggly, moggly mode, make this dust explode." Then it happened. Bang! Whiz! Snap! Loud exploding noises rang out by the cave's opening, and then Hobart climbed up the nearest tree. All of a sudden, an enormous crowd of Elwyns came charging out. This was Wendell's cue. He made sure there was no more Elwyns lurking at the back, and then he went in. But he had to be very quick and very quiet as well. The whole place stank of putrid fruit. And then Wendell saw Kozo in a cage which was made from wood and straw, with a sign hanging from the cage which simply said, "Supper." Quickly and quietly, Wendell yanked the door open and Kozo climbed onto his back. Wendell managed to sneak back out without any Elwyns spotting him. He could not believe it. Hobart's plan actually worked. The Elwyns were still sniffing about outside, squeaking and mumbling to each other, wondering what the commotion was. Wendell made sure that the coast was clear before making a run for it. The Elwyns were about, but they were quite a few feet away from him. So on tiptoe, he managed to get out of view from the horrid creatures. Nothing could the Elwyns find, so they went back inside their cave. At this point, Wendell and Kozo doubled back to where he last saw Hobart, who was still up the tree. "Hobart," said Wendell. "Quick, I have Kozo. Let's get out of here." Hobart climbed down the tree. He was very happy, not only seeing that Kozo was alive and well, but also because he was very proud of himself. Kozo and Hobart hugged each other. This made Wendell smile. All three turned and headed back to their homes quickly as possible. Little did our heroes know that they were being watched by a stray Elwyn who was still investigating out the Hobart's commotion. Chapter 4. While the Moglets and the ogre made their way back to Bubble Maze Hill, they felt proud and brave with themselves, congratulating each other as they went. Along the way, they met up with Chubby Pudding and his mob of lovelets. "Hello, Chubby," said Hobart. "What are you doing here?" "We have been looking for you. Your parents are furious that you have wandered off this far," said Chubby. "They were helping me get my own back from the Elwins," said Wendell. Chubby was not impressed. "You fools! Don't you know how dangerous it was going into the dark wood, risking your lives?" said Chubby. "But we had to rescue Kozo. The Elwins had snatched him and was going to eat him for supper," said Hobart. "All the same, it was not very clever of you to be heroes. You should have come up to us for help," was Chubby's reply. Once Chubby laid down the law to Hobart and Kozo, he suggested it was the time that they headed back for a celebration that the Moglets are safe and well. Sorry about the boops. After a long trek back and finally reaching Bubble Maze Hill, there was a very mixed reaction from the village. Word had got around very quick, and to some Hobart was a hero, but to his parents, both Hobart and Kozo were very naughty Moglets indeed. Celebrations and joyous cheer was heard all around in aid of the Moglets' safety. Wendell was enjoying himself as well. What they didn't know was this was just the beginning of their adventure. Chapter 5. The following morning saw the sun shining, big fluffy clouds, and the gentle songs of the birds. Wendell had stayed the night in a local barn. He had way too much nettle juice the night before, and he had a very sore head. He awoke with Kozo standing over him, offering him a bowl of hot mushroom soup for breakfast. Wendell smiled, stretched and yawned, and took the bowl of soup. Kozo smiled. He feels that he owes his life to Wendell, but he knows that Wendell done it out of friendship. Today was a new day. Wendell was looking forward to going back to his home and told the Moggles that the Lovelets that they were welcome there any time. This time both Hobart and Kozo decided to stay back at Bubble Maze Hill while Wendell made his way home. Chubby Pudding gave a wave to the friendly ogre as he left. Meanwhile, back at the dark wood, the Elwins were planning an attack on the mild-mannered Moggles. The leader of the Elwins was called Slumper, who was the biggest and the most evil of all the Elwins. It was pretty scary. He sat on his big rock-shaped throne in a huge cave shouting at the Elwins. "We have been made a fool of," he said. "How can these horrible little urchins like the Moggles come here and steal our feast?" Then, at the back, a scrawny little hand came up. "We were distracted by the loud noises that came from beyond our dwelling," he said. The hand belonged to Iffy, a small Elwin. "Silence, you ugly little maggot," bellowed Slumper. Iffy quickly hid behind another Elwin. "I will not tolerate intruders in my home. We shall seek revenge on these creatures and attack them," said Slumper. The Elwins cheered and bobbed up and down in excitement, making peculiar noises. This was not good news for the Moggles, even though they could do magic. It still may not be powerful enough to take on the Elwins. Slumper let out a hideous laugh that echoed throughout the cave. All the Elwins started to gather up their wooden clubs and shields and got ready to pay the visit to Bubble Maze Hill to defeat the Moggles and take their land. Wendell was asleep in his favourite chair, snoring away and dreaming of supper, when all of a sudden he heard something or someone creeping outside his front door. Now Wendell got up from his chair and slowly he opened the door. There he saw Iffy, the small Elwin who had his hand up. "Not another Elwin after my home," said Wendell. "Go away and don't come back." At that moment Iffy leapt up and bit poor Wendell's nose. "Ah!" screamed Wendell. Iffy laughed. "There's more where that comes from, you weevil face," said Iffy. Wendell was now very angry. He took a swing at Iffy, catching him on his shoulder, sending him flying across Wendell's front garden. "Ow!" moaned Iffy. Wendell grabbed hold of the Elwin very tightly so he could not escape. "What are you doing here?" he said. "I have come here to rid you of this world," said Iffy, and the rest of the Elwins are going to attack those silly Moggles and destroy them all. That's not going to happen, declared Wendell. At that point, Wendell took hold of Iffy by the feet, swung him round repeatedly, and threw him in the air and beyond the trees. Whee! Said Iffy as he became the first flying Elwin. Wendell now started to worry. He had got to get to Bubble Maze Hill before the Elwins do and to warn the Moggles of the coming attack. Meanwhile, Hobart and Kozo were sitting by the stream. They were talking about Wendell, wondering when will he visit. I miss Wendell already, said Kozo. He will be visiting again soon, said Hobart. I do hope so. I know we met him under dangerous circumstances, but I'm glad that it happened, said Kozo. Hobart smiled. Me too, he said. Chapter 6. After his adventure with the Mogglets, Wendell felt more brave and tougher now, like an ogre should be. He knew he had to get to Bubble Maze Hill as quick as he can to save his friends. Back at the Dark Wood, the Elwins were prepared to leave and attack the Moggles. They set off, alarmed up to the teeth, but they had no fear. Wendell ran as fast as his stumpy legs could take him to where the Moggles rested, who were unaware of what was coming. The Elwins had now set off their land taking. Slumper was in front, leading them off the Dark Wood. It was there that they came across Iffy, all battered and bruised from Wendell's doing. Iffy, why are you here? Did you not take care of that ugly ogre creature like I told you to do? Boomed Slumper. Squeaked Iffy. Not quite. As you can see from my face, he got the better of me, but not before I beat him up so bad that he fled, said Iffy, lying for his rotten teeth. Ha 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 ha, laughed Slumber, just as I thought, a stinking coward. Iffy smiled under his smelly breath. Meanwhile, Wendell was coming near to the Muggles' home. All the Moggles was out enjoying the bright sun with Chubby Pudding and the Lovelets, when all of a sudden the leaves on the trees started to shake and drop to the ground. All the Moggles stopped what they were doing and stood very still, looking at each other in some bewildered awe. No need to panic, said Chubby, reassuring everybody. Let's be calm. Then over the hill came Wendell, running as fast as he can. Look, said Kozo, it's Wendell. Wendell did a sudden stop as he got to the bottom of Bubble Maze Hill. Listen, everybody, he said. I have something that's very important to tell you. Chubby, being chief, stepped forward. What troubles you, my friend? He said. Wendell was extremely out of breath, but he managed to get the words out under his puffs and blows. The Elwins, they're on their way to attack and take your land, he said. All the Muggles looked shocked and startled at the news. Wendell, thank you for this information, he said. Wendell was pleased that he arrived in time to warn his friends. Hobart and Kozo and the rest of the Muggles and the Mogglets felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Right, Muggles, said Chubby, let's get ready to confront the Elwins. All the Muggles and the Lovelets cheered loudly. Meanwhile, not far away, the Elwins were only less than a mile away from Bubble Maze Hill. Slumber was leading the crowd of misfits, boldly laughing as he did so. Back at Bubble Maze Hill, Chubby made sure that all the Mogglets were safe and sound, and they would not be hurt when the Elwins attacked. This made Kozo and Hobart very unhappy, as they wanted to help fight the Elwins. They felt that they were not like the other Mogglets in the village. After their escapades with the Elwins previously, they felt that they are now ready to take their magic a step further. Outside, Chubby, the Lovelets, the Moggles and even Wendell were all at their places, ready for the confrontation. Then, within a blink of an eye, the ugly mass that was the Elwins stormed over the hill, charging towards our heroes. Attack! Screamed Slumper. All the Elwins were shouting a muddle of words as they got closer. At this point, Chubby came running out of the group of bushes with a crowd of Lovelets. Let them have it, lads, Chubby said. There was a big blurring mass as the Lovelets and the Elwins merged as they fought. Chubby and the Lovelets had big sticks and the Elwins had their wooden clubs and shields. There was banging and whacking and shouting. Then all the Muggles came out, throwing magic dust over the Elwins. There were whizzes and bangs and sparks everywhere. Wendell took it upon himself to go after Slumper, but Slumper was too fast for Wendell, and he saw him and with an almighty whack, Wendell got clubbed around his head, and there was a big thud as he fell to the ground. Slumper laughed. Chubby was fighting as many of the Elwins as he could. Even the Lovelets were doing their best. The Moggles' magic seemed to be helping, but it still wasn't as effective as they liked. To be honest, it wasn't looking good for the Moggles and Lovelets. Then, without anyone noticing, the slimy Elwin, that is Iffy, pulled a fast one. He had a flaming club, which he then threatened to burn down the Moggles' homes. At this point, the battle stopped, and all the Moggles and Lovelets stopped fighting and looked in horror. Slumber and the Elwins just stood and laughed. Ha 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 ha, laughed Slumber. Looks like we have won. The poor Moggles had run out of magic dust. There was nothing they could do. Hobart and Kozo looked in horror. There must be something we can do, said Hobart. You're right, Hobart, said Kozo. We have to think hard. Slumper looked very pleased with himself. Throw down your weapons, Moggles, or your homes will be burnt to a cinder, he demanded. The Moggles and Lovelets did what they were told. What else could they do? That's it. The Elwins have won. Slumper stood back as all the Elwins tied up Wendell, Chubby, the Moggles and the Lovelets. Chapter 7. While everyone was tied up, Hobart and Kozo sneaked out the back of their home and made their way to the potion hut. This was where the magic dust was created. I think I may have an idea, said Hobart. What idea is that, Hobart, said Kozo. Wait and see, but if it don't work, then we've lost the battle, and the Elwins would have won. But we can't have that, he said. Hobart told Kozo to get many empty bottles he could find in the hut. Kozo did so. Then Hobart got as many bags of magic dust he could find, and then he filled all the bottles halfway up with magic dust. Once he had done that, then he poured nettle juice into the bottles. Then he and Kozo gave all the bottles a big shake so everything blended. Right, Kozo, this is it. Time to be brave and go along with what I say. Okay, I will, said Kozo. Then Hobart loaded all the bottles onto a huge cart, which both the Mogglets pushed outside to where all their friends and family were. Iffy was the first person to spot them. Look, boss, Mogglets, he said. Chubby looked in horror. What are these Mogglets doing? He thought to himself. What is all this about? Said Slumber. Oh, please, Mr. Elwin, don't hurt us. We come in peace. We thought you may like to have some wine as a good sign of will, said Hobart. I do not have any good will, but I will take your wine, as today we, the Elwins, have defeated the good of Bubble Maze Hill, and we shall drink and toast our victory, and then have a nice Moggle and Lovelet barbecue to follow, said Slumber, laughing as he said it. All the Elwins laughed and cheered. Slumber took a bottle and said, Well, help yourself, lads. We're celebrating. All the Elwins took a bottle of Hobart's special wine. The Mogglets stood and watched, their little hearts beating, 2 to a dozen. To victory, said Slumber as he took a long swig at his bottle of Mogglet wine. All the Elwins followed suit. Within seconds, all the wine was gone, and then something happened. There was a huge gurgling and rumbling sound. All the Elwins dropped their bottles. What's happening to us, boss? Said Iffy. I'm not sure, said Slumber, but I feel somewhat peculiar. Hobart and Kozo looked pleased. Then, without warning, all the Elwins screamed in a very high sound, and then one by one they zoomed up into the air, never to return back down. Hooray! Said Kozo. It worked! Both Mogglets hugged each other. Not only have they defeated the Elwins, but they were also saved their friends and family. Both the Mogglets went around freeing everyone. What did you do? Asked Wendell. We poisoned the Elwins. We mixed magic dust in with nettle juice, and by swallowing it was all too much for them, said Hobart. Thank you, said Chubby. You are both heroes. Both the Mogglets smiled and went over to hug their parents. Later that day, there was much rejoicing as everyone celebrated the demise of the evil Elwins. Everyone was happy. All the Moggles and Mogglets were safe. Chubby and the Lovelets were delighted at this, and Hobart and Kozo were yet again the town's heroes. Even Wendell looked upon himself as a hero because he had confronted the Elwins. After that day, the Elwins were never seen or heard of again. Everyone was now living in harmony, and peace was restored back in the land of Bubble Maid's Hill until the time it was changed. But that's another story. The end.